Hi everyone and welcome to another painting tutorial from Promethean Paints. Today I'm going to show you how we painted the Garreon Corpsemaster from the Masters of Maelstrom box set on 40k. So I'm going to take you through how to do the sort of white armour, the glowing effects, everything you basically see here. So I started off with some sub-assemblies. So I've got the main guy on one part, I've got the head on a separate piece and the backpack on another piece, just because we're going to be applying the airbrush on the other part and I wanted to keep them separate. And I've also got the base separated as well. I base coated all of the parts in AK Tenebrous Grey, which is a very dark grey, almost black. We're going to be using the airbrush primarily at the beginning to get the sort of grey white armour. So first of all, I've showed you three colours there, which is sort of Vallejo Basalt Grey, Vallejo Light Grey, and then some Vallejo White Ink. We actually don't use the light grey, we just use the Basalt Grey and White Ink. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I've put some Basalt Grey into the airbrush, thinned it down to about a 50-50 mix, and then I'm pretty much covering the entirety of the armour in this Basalt Grey, leaving only the very small bits in the deepest shadows, that original Tenebrous Grey. So it's probably about 95% coverage. I'm sort of pointing the airbrush downwards just to get that initial sort of zenithal highlight that we have going on. But then I do go and do some undersprays, like from underneath, just to get some paint onto those areas, even if they're in the deepest shadows. And the idea here is we're going from really dark grey to almost white. Painting this white armour, we're not actually going to go up to pure white until I do a little bit of edge highlighting. We're only just going to be getting lighter and lighter greys. This first step is just base coating in the Basalt Grey. See, I'm using a relatively cheap airbrush. This was a £30 airbrush from Amazon. I've got a compressor that was only about £70. So if you're just using the airbrush for some base coating, then you don't have to go overly expensive. Just in case, if you're new to airbrushing, you don't want to go and spend a huge amount of money, just because the learning curve is quite steep and you don't want to have a lot of expensive equipment and expect to get amazing results straight away. Airbrushing, like normal painting, doesn't work that way. It takes a bit of practice, trial and error. You sometimes can break it or cause some damage, and the last thing you want to do is break an airbrush that's 150 or 200 pounds, whereas if you break something that's 30 pounds, it's not too much of a bad thing. We also make sure to do the same principles on the base on the bottom, on the guy, because I'm going to be painting that over in some red ink, so to get a sort of some contrast in light to dark shades on that guy. It's a good starting point whilst we have the airbrush out. Okay, so what I start to do from now is I'm just applying small drops of white ink into the airbrush itself to create lighter and lighter greys. So at first I add in probably 2 or 3 drops, so we make about a 70-30 mix of dark grey to white ink. And then I drop in more and more white ink until we sort of flip it around and we've got about a 90% white ink to the grey. And all I'm doing is spraying it in smaller and smaller places, focusing the lighter parts on the bit that you want to be sort of facing the sunlight, or the most brighter parts, and that way you get a nice contrast between white armor and the dark shadows. White armor is quite hard to paint because you could initially start off with white, but then you can't go any brighter and you can't go any, when you go darker it tends to stain it. Whereas if you start off with dark grey and go up to a light grey that's almost white, your white edge highlight can make it look brighter. Plus with the Corpsemaster, I didn't want it to be too bright. As he's a chaos guy, I always wanted it to be a little bit dark, and he's on a dirty battlefield as well, so it suits the Maelstrom characters that I'm creating from this box set. So I apply the same principles again to the guy on the base. And then what I do, because we're going to do some oil wash panel lining, what I do is I then varnish it all in the Mecha Varnish from Vallejo, which gives a really nice, shiny, glossy finish, which is fantastic to get capillary action with oil liners. So I use the AK Precision Panel Liner Black. It just saves you having to make any oil washes up, and it's a nice intense black. So once that the gloss varnish is dry, it takes a few minutes when you put it through the airbrush, you'll notice that you just touch this very small brush that you get with these panel liners, you touch that onto the areas, and then the capillary action just drags that paint all through those little deep recesses, so you haven't got to like wash the entire model and then wipe it all off. You can just do this in very small sections. You could of course wash the whole thing in a black oil wash or a known oil and then quickly wash it off, so it only stays in the recesses. But as you can see, it doesn't take long to go around the entire model and panel line all the deepest recesses around the armor, and where any of those shadows are. Just basically what we're doing is we're picking out details. We're just doing a very fine panel lining on the guy on the base, the backpack, and the Corpsemaster himself, just picking out the details. If you do get any build up or any large areas, you can get a little cotton bud or just use your finger and you can just smear it off and it comes off really quickly. Because of that gloss varnish, if you were to use a matte varnish here, one, the paint wouldn't run. A matte varnish is rough and it soaks the paint up really quick and can lead to staining, whereas this gloss varnish allows the paint to stay wet for longer and it flows easier and comes off a lot easier. Then once the panel lining is dry, it takes about 10-15 minutes to dry, I then use some Green Stuff World masking putty because I want to just airbrush some of the areas in red so that we've got the red Corsairs guy that this guy has taken the gene seed from. Is nice and red. So I've got some red ink. So that Green Stuff World putty is easy to apply. You just take it out of the little tub and just place it around. You could use blue tack or whatever, but that putty is designed so that it doesn't stick. And with that red ink through the airbrush, just cover any of the areas that you want to be red with the red ink. Taking care, short sharp sprays. It is ink, so it's very, very thin. It's almost like water, so you have to be very, very careful spraying it over. Move the airbrush around. As soon as you see that glistening on the model, that means it's wet and you need to move away, otherwise you get spider webbing. In hindsight, maybe I would have left his right arm off as a separate sub piece to paint the shoulder pad and put a bit more putty around where the arm is, because I did get a little bit of overspray where I was a bit careless with the puttying around some of the bits of the model. But if you want to do that, you can. You could leave the shoulder pad off, but his arm is actually part of the Garreon main model that's clinging onto his sort of tabard, so that is a bit tricky. You could paint on some red contrast paint like Bale Red, using the same sort of principles we've got here, but just using the paintbrush instead of the red ink through the airbrush. And that's the sort of base coating of the red done, and then you can just peel off that black putty, squidge it back up and put it into the silver metal tub that it came in. What I've done then is just a step in between. I've used that Tenebrous Grey and I've base coated all the areas that aren't armour back into that Tenebrous Grey base colour, just to give everything a sort of the same starting point. I'm going to start off with painting the leather, and for that I use a base coat of AK Grim Brown. So anything that you want to be leather, just do a base coat of a really, really dark brown. For Games Workshop, the Warhammer paints that they're now called, you would use sort of like a Rhinox hide or maybe Dryad bark, just a very, very dark brown. If it's got a little hint of red in it, it's a bit better to give the leather a little bit of life. I skip a little ahead, but don't forget to paint the little bit of leather that's on the guy on the base. I then use, for the next layer, this is to bring out the sort of detailing now and to highlight it. I cover about 90% of the leather in AK Beast Brown, which is a really nice reddish brown, like Mornfang brown from Warhammer. So just make sure you pick out a lot of the material, leaving only probably about a small amount of the grim brown in the deepest recesses. And instead of us having to do washes over this all the time, I always leave a little gap between each part, so there's a gap between the strap and the tabard underneath, so that you separate the items. If you don't do that, you can just always go over it with like a dark wash, like an Agrax Earth shade, a Reikland Flesh shade, or a Nuln Oil, or you could pin wash it again with some black pin liner, or dark brown that you can also get. But here what we're doing is we're picking out the shapes, picking out the highlights, leaving the grim brown in the deepest recesses. Next layer, and this is for our edge highlighting and picking out some of the sort of raised areas and creases and rips and tears. I'm using AK Saddle Brown. And with this, like I said, you just do an edge highlight and then pick out all of your raised areas, adding in little scratches, marks and whatever to that worn leather, and do that again on the main tabard, the gun pouch, the belt, and the guy that's on the base as well. He's got a little bit of leather just around him. You could stop at this point if you're happy with how your leather looked, but I wanted to go 2 steps brighter. So I'm using Vallejo Brown Rose, which is a little bit like Cadian Fleshtone, and then some AK Vamperic Flesh, which is probably Pallid Witch Flesh or Flayed One Flesh in the Warhammer range. And this is a very small edge highlight, picking out the finer points where you want it to be more highlighted, more worn and torn with the brown rose. And then that Vampiric Flesh is used as an even smaller highlight on the areas that you want really, really worn and picking out to highlight sort of the bit where he's grabbing onto his tabard at the bottom, the wear and tear around the gun pouch where the gun is getting off, maybe the neck area of the tabard. But these 2 colours are just used to show some really heavily worn areas with some wear and tear. Add a little bit of water to each of these. They are quite powerful colours, and they can be quite garish if not watered down. Just a drop of water. So really, I mean, on the wet palette, I just do, for every drop of paint or 2 drops of paint, I add a drop of water. So it's about a 2-to-1 mix between paint and water. But as I explained in some of my classes, thinning paints is quite a tricky thing because every colour is different, every paint brand is different. AK Grim Brown dilutes different to Rhinox Hide, and it dilutes different to every other colour that you've got on that palette, and you just need to learn that as you go along. But a safe principle is cut a few drops of paint, 1 drop of water, and then go from there. You can always add more paint, but to take the water back out is really hard, so it's always worth just putting in what you think and then adding a little bit more paint or water to it just to get that mix right. Okay, next stage, we're going to start doing some of the metallics, and I'm using AK gunmetal, which is just a very dark metallic colour. This gives a subtle blueness to it as well, and over that Tenebrous Grey it works really well. What I'm doing here is I'm just picking out anything that I want to be silver, a few little trinkets that he's got around his neck, and much like the Games Workshop on the artwork on the box, I'm only edge highlighting the trim on the armour panels to make them look dirty and worn. If you do paint the whole things, you can just go over it again with some Nuln Oil or Angrax shade, and then I pick out anything basically here metallic that I want to be metallic, just on the body and on the guy on base. For the gold, I go straight to the bright gold, which is AK old gold, which would be sort of Retributor armor. And I just paint in, much like I did with the silver, anything you want to be gold, just base coat it with the gold of your choice. As I'm using AK old gold, which is a very nice vibrant gold, but yeah, Retributor armor, any bright gold you want. You could, if you wanted to, do darker gold and then highlight it, but all I do here is a little bit later on, I just wash over some of that gold with either some Reikland Flesh shade or just a wash of Tenebrous Grey, just to give it a little bit of get like some colour into the recesses, to give them a little bit of definition and shape. But there's not too much gold on this guy. A couple of chaos symbols and a couple of the sort of jars that he's got around his body. There's also a little bit of gold there. With the main parts done now, we're actually going to move on to doing some of the glowing effects, and we're going to focus first on the backpack. So in that tub of paint there, what I've got is my mix of 1 to 1 to 1. So that's 1 drop of Vallejo ink, 1 drop of water, and 1 drop of contrast medium. I used to do a few more drops of water or a few more drops of contrast medium, but I actually found it diluted the white too much. What we're creating here is a sort of white contrast mix, so you get a nice blending of white where the white goes into the recesses and is nice and vibrant, and not so vibrant on the areas around it like a contrast or wash does. And all I did was I just made a lot in a pot, so just measured it out using little syringes and then just poured it into the contrast medium pot. So I've always got it on hand, so I haven't got to make it all the time because I do use this quite often. But all I'm doing here is the white paint is the base of our fluorescent colours, so I'm just putting this into all the areas that I want to have white glowing, like glowing effects. So the brighter the white, the brighter the fluorescent effect will be, and the surrounding areas will be a bit dull. Ignore when I start putting this around like I'm doing here. I actually don't add any glowing effects to these. I do a rust effect instead. I had an idea that I wanted parts of this to be glowing, but it oddly didn't make any sense when I was doing it. So just ignore what I'm doing here on some of these points. We cover these off a little bit later after the rust effects we've done. But yeah, the main part here was the actual his claw, his Doc Ock claw that he's got going around. I wanted that to have sort of a glowing, dark, reddish orange feel to it. This stuff does take a while to dry, probably 10-15 minutes like any shade would. If you didn't do this, if you didn't have any white ink, you could just use some watered down white acrylic paint like the AK Intense White. It just might take a couple of coats to get a nice intensity to it. You sometimes find with white, if it's not a white ink, if it's just white acrylic, it can go a bit chalky and hard to control. So once it's all dry, we're going to move back to the airbrush, and what I'm using here is some Green Stuff World Fluorescent Orange Yellow. So it's a sort of pre-mixed orange and yellow together. Just a good base colour. Saves you having to do a yellow base coat and then go over the top of it with an orange. So this is a really good one. It needs a little bit of watering down, so I add a few drops of it into the airbrush and then a drop of paint just to help it flow a bit easier. And all I'm doing here is I'm just going to cover all of the white and a little bit of the surrounding areas in the fluorescent orange yellow through the airbrush. I then get some Green Stuff World Fluorescent Red, and I put that into the airbrush with a little drop of water. And here what I'm doing is I'm not spraying it directly into those central areas, as I want those to remain really bright orangey yellow. What I'm doing is I'm trying to get this red into the surrounding areas. So I'm just aiming the airbrush and moving the model so that the paint isn't flowing directly into those central areas. It's almost skimming over the top so that you leave that core brightness, but you're surrounding the other areas in that intense red colour to give it the sort of glowing effects that we're going for. You'll find here by darkening down the surrounding areas, you're actually intensifying the glow in the middle, and you can add as much of this as you like. I find this red really does help intensify it, but if you do put too much on it, you can lose that glowing orangey yellowness. So just be a bit careful and try and just keep that airbrush nozzle pointed away from directly into those central points. So you're pointing it down or away from the model. And then once I've got the airbrush out to get the green glowing effect in around his head, go back to that white ink and just spray the white ink into the center part there where his head's going to sit, and then I just do little bits on the left and right so that that white ink just goes over onto the shoulder pad on either side. And then very simply I grab some AK fluorescent green, again a little bit of water in there to water it down through the airbrush, and just paint that area with the fluorescent green, taking care because it can spider web quite easily. And yeah, just cover those areas in the fluorescent green. Okay, I then went ahead and just base coated, whilst all that was drying. I just did some slight work onto the base. I added some grass tufts, base coated it all in grim brown, and then did some dry brushings with some AK mud earth and AK light earth, which are just dark earthy colours that you can dry brush, like Xandri dusts and Steel Legion drab, that kind of colours. I decided I wanted to make to fit in line with the other guys in this Maelstrom box. I wanted his backpack, all that metallic stuff, to be absolutely filthy rusty. So I used the Dirty Down Rust, give it a really good shake. It's got sort of rust residual at the bottom of it and rust pigments and stuff at the bottom of it. So it reads good shake. It is acrylic base, but it is a bit stinky. You've got to be a bit careful with it. And it works in a way that water activates the rust effect. So you're sort of creating the rust effect by activating the rust that's in there. So I put it on in thick globs where I want the rust and texture to be really thick, and then dip my brush in a pot of water and then sort of spread it out using thinner and thinner where you've added more water to it, so you're sort of spreading it out. It takes a little bit of practice, and I used some old Rhino models that I had, some old terrain stuff to practice with it. There is a couple of videos and stuff on the Dirty Down website that shows you how to use it. They do like verdigris and moss effects as well. It is really good stuff. It saves having to do multiple washes with acrylics. I find it's just a nice way of getting rust very quick if you're not too fussed about it going all over the place. If you want to do controlled rust effects in specific areas, then you might be better off using washes to do that, because this can go all over the place. And same principles here over the base. Just slap it on in the thick areas where I want to be nice and thick, and then dip my brush in the water and then wash it out either side. Again, it takes 10-15 minutes, sometimes longer, depending on how thick you've put it on and how much water there is. But as you'll notice, as it starts to dry, those areas start to go dark brown or really bright orange, depending on how you've applied it, to give that really nice rusty, dirty, earthy look to the model. So now we're moving on to the face, and this is how I paint Garreon's face and the red Corsair on the bottom. And I start off with some Kislev Flesh as the base colour, because I wanted a quite pale face, and Kislev Flesh is a nice pale flesh colour that's still quite thick. So just paint the face with a couple of coats of the Warhammer Kislev Flesh. So there is a lot going on with the face. There's a lot of backwards and forwards between glazes and washes and all sorts of stuff, and I'll try and talk you through as best I can. First step we're going to do to get some definition, and instead of using a standard flesh wash, what I use is some AK Wine Red, which is like Warhammer Carroburg Crimson, or the Volopus Pink, the contrast. either paint that you use, the wine red or the Voltus pink or the Caribou crimson, you must water it down very, very heavily. So there's about 2 or 3 drops of water and half a drop of paint, and then you just wash that pinkish, reddish, purplish colour over the head, and you'll get a nice, more lifelike wash than just your standard flesh washes. You can use a standard flesh wash, but I like this red because it gives a worn, stretched, chaotic feel. What I then do is, once that's all dry, is I go back to the Kislev flesh and I start to just layer in all of the raised areas, like around his forehead, his nose, his mouth. Don't worry about the green glow yet. We're going to create that once we've done a lot of work around the other areas of his face. So it's easier right now just to paint the face as normal, and then we can add the glowing, the OSL effects a little bit later. So yeah, just pick out all those raised areas as you naturally would when you're layering a face. For the next layer, which is our main highlight, we're going to be using Warhammer Flayed One Flesh. And again, water it down a little bit, little drop of water into that. And then again, just picking out the very big raised areas, so just edge highlighting really around the sort of scars and mouth and nose and eyes. Just picking out the areas that you want to be the most bright. If it looks quite garish, then just water the paint down a little bit more. But sometimes having those big lines of paint just helps stand out the texture that we're going for, and the features on the face. We're going to be applying a few more washes as well, which can tone down those effects that we're creating. So now what I noticed was some of those features weren't as pronounced, so I'm just glazing in now a few more areas with that red ink wash, the red wine wash that we created, just to get some more definition around his eyes and just where the skin is the most stretched and joining, as I wanted those to really stand out, and it helps tone down some of the effects that we had as well as some of those layering effects that we had. And as you can see now, I'm going to be highlighting the guy that's on the base. It doesn't have to be really good, the highlights on this guy. It was really just picking out the main points, as obviously the guy's dead. So I didn't want the skin to be too bright, just to be a little bit more red and worn and battered. You could add, if you wanted to, a little bit of Druky Violet that was washed, that's sort of watered down into some of those recesses to get a little bit of a bruised effect going on, and even a little bit of green for some rotten effects if you wanted the skin to look a little bit rotten. Here you can see I've made a wash of Tenebrous Grey, so that's 1 drop of Tenebrous Grey to many drops of water, and I'm just glazing this into his eye sockets and the areas that I want to darken down a little bit. So yeah, mainly his eye sockets, some parts around his mouth. It's just those scars I wanted to make really, really deep, so that it stands out against the brightness of the highlight. So there's not much paint on the brush, a lot of control. I'm still using a size 0 brush, don't have to use a small brush, but it's just adding some definition into those areas and those deepest recesses. before I move on to the glowing effects, what I was doing there is just making a mix 50-50 of white and the Tenebrous Grey to create a sort of purplish grey highlight colour for his hair. And it also works as a good highlight colour for any blacks as well, so if you've got any bits of black on the model, you could just use that colour to highlight those as well. Okay, with AK Deep Green, we're now going to bring in the glowing effect, so the reflections from the glowing effect around this sort of gorget area onto his head. So what I've done is I've watered down some of that AK Deep Green, so probably about a 50-50 mix, and I'm just going to now apply it around all the areas where I want to have that green bounce reflection off. So that's, make sure it's underneath his neck, on the sort of neck area, and then I'm just dragging it downwards. So from his, when I'm doing it on his face, if you're dragging it downwards towards the bottom of his face, it means most paint is left at the bottom. So wherever you remove your paintbrush is where the most paint is left. So if you're going to be painting it upwards, the glowing effect, the sort of the reflection of that light is going to be towards the top, not towards the bottom. So you need to keep that in mind when you're doing your brush work. So yeah, just applying it in very, very thin layers, getting a nice intense green towards the bottom of his head, leaving a nice fade from green to the flesh colours at the top. Don't worry if it looks a bit odd at the moment, we're going to apply some more dark washes again with that Tenebrous Grey so that we blend in, so there's a dark line between the green glowing effect on his face and the flesh colour, so you get like an area of shadow between the reflected light and the face brightness. We've moved over to white, and what I'm going to do here is, this is the areas where I want to paint some fluorescent green over the top. No, sorry, not fluorescent green. We're actually going to jump straight to fluorescent yellow because we've got a nice green base here. So these are the areas that I want to be the most brightest green. So I do a little edge highlight around his neck, a little bit on each shoulder pad where it's on the metallic, and then I do a little bit on the bottom of his face, sort of the bottom of his chin, his lip, and the sort of metallic areas on either side of his head. Where his helmet sort of locks in to a couple of little dots there, as that's where I want the most intense glow. Then I grab some AK fluorescent yellow and just paint it over those areas you've just applied the white. So you paint it on the white itself and a little bit either side, so you get a transition between that green and to the yellow, and you'll find that you'll get a nice glowing effect now that really makes the neck area really, really bright. and the reflections that are coming from that on his face and the shoulder pads, really bright reflections as well. Doing here now is I've got some Tenebrous Grey wash again, so it's and now I'm painting, as you can see, upwards. So I'm painting now away from the green up onto the flesh, so you get a sort of shadowing effect happening now. So you'll have bright green reflections on his head, then a shadow area, and then the highlights to his skin. So you don't get a highlight to a highlight, you get a highlight, a shadow, and then our face highlights. And also it really helps sell the sort of ominous look the guy's got, like he's looking down on you. Makes the glowing effect really pop, and it makes the highlights around his face really stand out as well, to have that shadow line. Without it, what you would have had was a highlight of reflected light, then onto a highlight of a skin highlight, which when you look at it straight on, it didn't make any sense. You had to have that shadow gap in between, so that this way the light is working works best for how the light is going across the model, and all of those kind of things come with a little bit of practice. So moving on to the sort of final stages now, and one of them is I just dry brush some gunmetal from AK onto those metallic areas, just to make them look a little bit more that they are metallic and they've got a little bit more wear and tear to them. Then I use AK Tenebrous Grey, and I then dry brush this over the core, that sort of, sorry, not the core, the armour that's surrounding that claw, so that you've got dark, cold areas with the hot part of the central bit that's running through that arm, that sort of Doc Ock arm that he's got. So it gives a sort of smoky, dirty after effect, but intensifies that glowing effect that we've got running through. So with some more brush work, so now I've attached Garreon to the actual model itself, making sure all the joints are nice and secure where he's super glued down. And I've got some AK fluorescent orange on the wet palette, and this is going to be used in two ways. This is going to be used to intensify the core glowing effect that we've got running through that arm. So just in a few places, just add a little bit of that fluorescent orange. And what I also do with the fluorescent orange is where I really want that rust effect to be most intensely orange, where you can see it's already dried around some of those areas, and you'll notice with your one you'll have some areas of really bright orange. I add a little bit of this fluorescent orange over that to really help sell that rusty effect that the model is absolute filth. It's a trick I learned a couple of models ago that I was painting from the one of the Age of Sigmar box sets, that fluorescent orange really helps sell the rust effect and gives it a kind of otherworldly look as well. So just a few drops of that here and there where you want it to be most rusty. You could just use, if you wanted to, some Troll Slayer Orange or some Fire Dragon Bright or AK Light Rust, any bright orange colour, but this fluorescent I think really makes it pop and stand out. So just going to paint some other glowing effects, like for his blood that's in the vial on his right hand side. So I use some AK Magenta. I water it down a little bit, probably a 50-50 mix. And what I'm doing here with the Magenta is I'm painting downwards so that the most paint is collected towards the bottom of the vial, as if that's where the most liquid is contained. And because it's a glowing liquid, obviously it would have some glowing effects around it. So the magenta is the sort of our base colour of that glow. So as I've mentioned before, where you leave the brush is where the most paint is left. So painting downwards means that a majority of the paint is going to be left at the bottom of that vial. You can see I'm doing a few layers of this just to intensify that magenta at the bottom. So each time I'm adding a layer, I'm applying less and less paint to a smaller area, so that you almost get pure magenta at the bottom and probably a 70% coverage at the top. With the green, just going to do a little glowing effect on his little screen. So that's just painted in AK Deep Green at first. I then do a couple of little edge highlights in pure white on that screen, and then I just paint over it in fluorescent green just to get a subtle green glowing effect. As you can see there, I use some AK Intense White with a few drops of water so that it's a little bit runny, and I'm just pushing the paint downwards towards the bottom of that vial and adding a couple of little pure white dots like little bubbles of gorp that's floating around inside of it. I then, once all of that's dry, I then paint over all of it with some Green Stuff World Fluorescent Rose, which is, you could use Fluorescent Magenta from AK, but I like the Fluorescent Rose as it's got a slight reddish hint to it, and you can just paint over that in the Fluorescent Rose. Okay, we're almost there. With some Cadian Fleshtone, I'm just going to do some highlights of the red armour. You could use a brightish red or a pink for this, but I think Cadian Fleshtone just does a nice subtle highlight over red. Little bit thin down, drop of water in when you put a drop of paint on. And all I'm doing here is just picking out any edge highlights with this Cadian Fleshtone, adding a few scratches, dents and marks here and there, nothing too much. There's not much red actually. Mainly on the guy on the base and a little bit on the Corpsemaster's shoulder pad. So the final stage, with some AK Intense White, watered down, is I'm going to be adding some edge highlighting to his white armour. Have to be careful here. It is quite a increase we're going for. You'll notice how not white we are, how more grey the armour is when you start doing pure white edge highlighting. So you do need to be a little bit careful. But subtle edge highlight. And then what I do is on one of the big armor panels on his leg is I add some scratches and dents here and there, and then I do a glaze of white, really heavily watered down white, so that I can then push that paint into those central areas. So you push the paint from left to right and then push the paint right to left, so in that central area you get the most paint gathered but a nice transition up into the white. Glazing is easy to do, but you have to be very, very careful. You have to know where the paint is going to finish. You have to understand that you're going to be transitioning from your colour, from going away from the colour that you've already painted. So you'd have to get your transitions right. And wherever you leave your paintbrush is where that most paint is going to be left. When you're glazing, you don't have much paint on the brush at all. If you have a lot of paint on your brush, that's washing, so that's pouring the paint into those areas. Glazing is very, very subtle, and when you're glazing, you do multiple glazes to get the desired effect that you want, transitioning between different colours and different mixes of colours. It all comes with practice. Trying something new, watching a tutorial, seeing how they're using the colours and pushing it around. Using the airbrush does get rid of having to do glazing in a way, because you're sort of glazing with the airbrush when you're doing those transitions. And white is notoriously hard to glaze with because it's such a pure, intense colour. If you're glazing white straight over black, it's very hard to do. With the airbrush, it's very easy to do. But with glazing with a brush, it's very, very hard, especially with white, as white can be a hard paint to water down because of its chalkiness. But if you find, like here, it's not working, you can always add a bit more water onto your brush and then transition it, quickly wiping it away with your finger. It gives a nice textured look to it. It all just takes a little bit of practice. And once the white armour is done, that's the model finished. So a really fun model to do. A couple of hours he was on the table for, not too long considering how much detail and really cool effects we've got going on. Over the white armour, I did use some Vallejo, some AK Ultra Matte Varnish, and that's only over the white armour areas because obviously they're still shiny from the Mecha Armour gloss varnish that we used. So I did a coat of that just to tone that down a little bit, otherwise it was too shiny and messing with the glowing effects that we've got. So yeah, as always, my lovelies, I hope you enjoyed that tutorial. This Masters of Maelstrom box set has been really fun to paint. I've got a theme running through all of them of dirty, gory, grimy, chaos, grim, dark filth. This was one of my favourites. They've all been my favourites actually. Really nice models. So yeah, hope you've enjoyed. Hope you've found it easy to follow along. As always, like, comment and subscribe. Let me know how you've gotten on with yours. And yeah, keep on painting and happy painting, my fellow painters.